Good evening, everyone. Welcome to BS and Beer. We have been on vacation, but we couldn't go the whole summer without a little BS. So we're really excited. Tonight's book club. We have Musings of an Energy Nerd by Martin Holladay, and Martin is here to answer all of your burning questions. So everyone here in the chat box, because we can't see you otherwise, introduce yourself. Tell us what you're drinking. Tonight it is kombucha, because if you can't drink beer, you might as well drink some kombucha. So mango kombucha tonight. So Emily Mottram, I'm here in Maine. It is in the 80s, but very humid here. So I won't complain since it's clearly hotter in other places. BS and Beer is a grassroots movement. Everyone volunteers their time to bring you what we hope is fun and interesting commentary. We want to say thank you to Fine Homebuilding and Green Building Advisor for being our media partners and making the show happen every week. So Travis, if you want to give us some announcements.
Well, I've got all the announcements. I'm excited to be back. Thanks everyone for joining us. Just a reminder, since it's been a while, you can find the chat box icon at the bottom of your screen. Of course, if you're going to chat, be sure to click all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your questions and your comments. Every week, Fine Homebuilding sends out reminders. And if you want to receive those, as well as any other information, of course, you can join our mailing list at thebsandbeershow.com or check out the weekly post at Green Building Advisor. That usually goes up Sunday mornings. The video recording of tonight's show will be available at Green Building Advisor. And of course, all past shows can be found on YouTube through a link at thebsandbeershow.com. An audio-only version of the BS and Beer Show is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And then I've got a few more special announcements. I know that that's all run of show stuff, but this is the goods. So you've probably heard the Pretty Good House team is writing a book, and they're looking for some case studies to include in it. So if you've designed or built what you would consider to be a pretty good house, please submit your project through the link that we'll share in the chat box. Also, the Midwest Building Science Symposium is back, second annual, and that's coming up in Kansas City, the 28th and 29th of September. Same location, Boulevard Brewery. So, of course, I'm drinking some Boulevard tonight. It's an open forum for professional discussion as well as some surprise guests at the live FHB podcast recording after for the Keep Craft Alive event. But that's at the end of the two-day Midwest Building Science Symposium. The Fine Homebuilding Keep Craft Alive event is a separate event that's taking place after the symposium. So stay for a day and a half of symposium as well as another half day for Keep Craft Alive. I hope to see Patrick McComb and Rob Wadsack there in person for the podcast. It's going to be a lot of fun. So please join us, and you can register for that at a link that's going to be in the chat also. Emily, would you like to introduce our guests?
Yeah, I would be happy to. In fact, I don't know a lot about most of you, and so I'm going to say your name, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself. So thank you for all volunteering your time to come on and talk a little BS with us. First on my list is Kyle Mocht. He's an architect. So Kyle, tell us who you are and what you're drinking.
So I am Kyle Mocht, principal of Mocht Architecture, founded by my dad back in 1990. I'm drinking water from my Pretty Good House water bottle.
Nice.
And I'm happy to be sitting in the first project that I did outside of my master's degree, which was a passive solar home, but was also super insulated. And I've learned a whole heck of a lot in terms of some of the things you talked about in your book, Martin, in terms of overheating and all sorts of uncomfortable issues and all sorts of interesting things with that. But
awesome. Anyway. We also have Carol, and Carol is an architect. Carol, tell us a little bit more about who you are and if you're drinking something.
I am. I'm drinking herbal iced tea that I picked from my backyard. So it's Tulsi and mint and lemon balm and lots of ice because it's hot in Burlington, Vermont. And so I'm an architect and I practice in Maine and Vermont, and I'm also a certified passive house consultant.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And we have Brian Wiley.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I am in Boise, where I teach graphic design at Boise State University. And some of my work is with the Hazard and Climate Institute here in Boise, in visualizing wildfire smoke and wildfire data, which is why I'm drinking a Meriwether cider. We'll taste a fall in hopes for less smoky times. So cheers, everyone.
Cheers. June.
Yes, I'm on. Because it is so hot, but I also have work to do after the show is over. I'm switch hitting between drinks. So one of them, can you see it? Oops, it's always tricky. That, can you see it now?
Yes, Maine Beer Company lunch.
There. It's not lunch, I know, but it's still good. This is from Freeport, Maine. Highly recommended by my daughter, which is why it's in the fridge. And this is just roasted barley tea, cold, really cold. And it's what they mainly drink in the summer in Japan when they're not drinking beer. And because I lived there for such a long time, I developed a liking for it. So I can't do without it in the summer.
Great. Then we have Carl Saville.
Hey, Carl Saville, I'm drinking Queen's Weiss. It's a really good wheat beer from a local brewery here in Atlanta. I'm located in Decatur, Georgia. I'm a recovered remodeler, and I currently do green building consulting, and I certify multifamily buildings and single family buildings sort of throughout the country. And I learned after I built it that I have a pretty good house, which is apparently going to be featured in the book, which I'm very excited about.
And last but not least, our hidden Brew Crew host, Brian Pontalillo, coming back to join us. Brian, say hello.
Hey, everyone. Glad to be back. I'm Brian Pontalillo from Fine Homebuilding and Green Building Advisor. I have, even though it's in the 90s here in Connecticut, I have an herbal tea, ginger and mango, because I am in my mother's air-conditioned condo right now, and tea seemed like the right drink for this evening. I am also starting a building project, hopefully, if things go well this fall. I aspire for a pretty good house, but that pretty good house is a stretch for me. But I will say that, and it segues nicely into tonight's show, is that when I realized I was going to be starting a building project, the first person I emailed was Martin Holladay, and I simply said, Martin, what would you build? And that's where my process started. So I'm really excited to be here with Martin.
What a perfect introduction. You guys all didn't come to see us. You came to see Martin. So our special guest tonight and the author of the book that we're talking about for book club, Martin Holladay, was the editor of Green Building Advisor for over 10 years. He's now retired, but he still writes for the Green Building Advisor column, Musings of an Energy Nerd. Martin built his first passive solar house in northern Vermont in 1974, and he's lived off the grid since 1975. He's worked as a plumbing and wholesale counterperson, roofer, remodeler, builder, and has been an editor and writer at Fine Homebuilding, the Journal of Light Construction, and Energy Design Update magazine. So Martin has a breadth of knowledge. We're excited that our guests come from different parts of the country, and that we'll get a chance to really talk about different parts of the book. So to kick us off, Martin, anything I missed? What are you drinking, and why'd you write this book?
I'm drinking a glass of ice water, tap water with ice cubes for a good summer beverage. The book was suggested by several people at Taunton, and it's basically a collection of my blogs from GBA, woven together in a logical formats, kind of in the order of a typical construction for a single family house, and with some introductory material and transition material to make it more book-like and less disjointed. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Awesome. It's a great book. I think I told you before we started, I just added it to suggested reading lists for the class I'm teaching this fall. So it's a great overview of both how people build and how to do it a little bit better. So I'd love to go around first with our guests that we invited to join us, and hear if you had thoughts about the book, reading the book, or a specific question you wanted to ask Martin. So we can go in the order of your introductions, and I can start with Kyle.
Sounds great.
Kyle?
This book was really interesting for me because everything that you talked about was sort of where I started in my career. In terms of HERS, I was a HERS rater. I started in design build, did a lot of payback analysis for commercial energy consulting, and then residential energy consulting, then residential construction. And so I sort of went through this passage and did a lot of my opinions and decisions based off of energy modeling. And so it wasn't till, say, 5 years ago that I got the fire hose of Passive House Kool-Aid in my face and drank it hard. And that sort of got washed away a little bit after reading this. And it sort of reminded me of some of the things that I once learned, and made me re-question a little bit of what I've been proposing in the Passive House world now. And so one big question that I had for you is, you ripped Passive House pretty hard in some ways. And I'm curious in terms of when some of those sections were written. It seemed like, I know this was published in 2018. FIAS broke away from Passive House in 2015, partly because of some of the things that frustrated you with the Passive House certification process. And right now I'm going through my first official Passive House building, and frankly, we had drone footage of all the tree coverage to prove that there was enough passive solar entering the southern side of the house to make sure that we were meeting the requirements. So we really went down many, many rabbit holes. And I'm just sort of curious in terms of when that section was written, and if your opinions or thoughts have changed at all with FIAS adapting and changing with what they consider cost effectiveness over a life cycle analysis.
Well, to the best of my recollection, most of the Passive House chapters in the book were written before the FIAS divorce. And so they were based on the original Passive House standard as developed by Wolfgang Feist in Germany. That said, I'd have to reread the chapters or look up the dates on the blogs. I mean, if you can trace the original blogs on GBA from which the chapters were derived, they are all dated. So it wouldn't be too hard to figure that out. I have to give Katrin Klingenberg a lot of credit for her FIAS innovations. She, after kind of digging in her heels, defending the Passive House standard as developed in Germany for several years, she kind of had this aha moment and realized that it was time for a revolution, and all of the changes that she advocated for were in the right direction. So that was really heartening to see. That said, they didn't go down the cost effectiveness track, and she and the other developers of the FIAS standard were very candid about that. They stopped short of cost effectiveness as a goal and said, well, we're compromising between cost effectiveness and the fact that we really believe in insulation beyond cost effectiveness for a variety of reasons, which I think are defensible, partly on climate issues, which are more and more important for all of us, and other issues as well. So I guess that's what I would say on the whole FIAS versus Passive House issue. I think to some extent, this is my observation, there's less of a focus on the Passive House standard now in the North American high performance building industry or group or whatever you want to call it, culture right now than there was when I wrote the chapters of this book. I mean, Passive House kind of burst on the media's awareness and got a lot of media attention and was the darling of a lot of writers, and I think probably got a little more attention than it deserved. But these days, other approaches are achieving more notice, and people aren't talking Passive House all the time the way they were 8 or 10 years ago. That's my perception. I may be wrong.
Martin? I know from a multi-family perspective, it's gone crazy in terms of production of square footage, but single family, I don't know what the latest numbers are in terms of whether it's keep increasing or not. But anyway. You're
absolutely right. It's multifamily is where FIAS is doing all of their work, almost all of it.
Martin?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I
can. You just mentioned that there are some new approaches. Are there any in particular that you like?
I don't remember talking about new approaches. So be more specific in your question. I want to know what you're aiming at.
No, so this is just out of overwhelming intellectual curiosity, when you were talking just now about the passive house standard, at first you said essentially they were the only kid on the block. But now that there are other kids on the block and other options, if you will, or other avenues, that things have changed.
Well, I mean, I think certainly we could talk about Pretty Good House, which is, for New England-based people, what everyone's talking about. It's poorly defined, but it's what GBA has always trumpeted, thanks to Mike Maines and Dan Colbert and the other main people who invented and promoted the idea of Pretty Good House. So what is Pretty Good House? It's doing better than code, but not as much as the original passive house standard. That's the way I see it. And what it means is we believe if you believe in a pretty good house, you want to pay attention to air tightness and energy performance without going overboard. So I would call that, I guess, the alternative way that GBA trumpets.
I just want to point out too that this isn't meant to be Martin on the hot seat either. So if you guys want to also, weigh in on book discussion, and you can have discussions amongst yourself as well. So we want Martin to come back. So
Wait, this isn't a roast? I thought this was
I don't feel like I'm in the hot seat.
This is not what I signed up for.
Oh, wow.
There's an awful lot of the book that is not in reference to passive house. In fact, when I read it, I did not pick up on some of the more scathing passive house reviews that I've read. That was like an undercurrent to me. Most of what I got out of the book was very practical. Like I actually build this stuff for a living, and this all made a lot of sense to me. And it seemed very much like a practical guide with I'm derailing the conversation. I guess the passive house argument is not what I thought would be the focus of this conversation either. So certainly everyone's opinion is welcome. Mine was not in reference to that at all.
And someone deleted all of your order out of the thing. So I'm just going to go with the people on the screen. So Brian Wiley, you're actually up next. Do you have a question? Did you have a discussion that you wanted to bring up from the book? I know you not being in the architecture or design specific world, was there something about this book that?
Yeah, well, there are so many things, and it's funny to read these as a compendium because, in GBA, which I'm a member of, you can read them out of order, you can read them in kind of, depending on what kind of keywords you put in. And so it was so helpful to have it in a book format first, I'll say that. And I think it did make a lot of sense to me as somebody that is not a HERS rater, passive house certified, not an energy modeler or anything like that. There was so much pragmatic advice in here. I was a little disappointed to find out that, I first time homeowner, we've got like a 1955 ranch. At least half of the banish these details from your plans exists on my own personal home. So that was a bit of a bummer. Although thanks to some of the articles, not just Martin's, but GBA in general, been able to kind of slowly work through those. So I guess my question is relative, and can be to everyone because, Mike's here, Emily's here, but is Pretty Good House, which obviously, as Martin mentioned, is kind of the model GBA follows. How do you feel like that, I guess my question is relative to some of the new climate data that just came out and things like that, and your belief in embodied carbon, and we have a finite amount to spend. Where does a retrofit situation, what's the tipping point for that? We can't go back and put 12, not that Pretty Good House advocates for 12 inches under a foundation or anything like that, but at what point do we just need to, I think you said early on, just need to have some cold lemonade or throw on a sweater and call it good? Do you know what I mean? Has that thinking changed even in the last year or two, given some of the stuff we're finding out?
Well, absolutely. And the trouble with the embodied carbon analysis, which is all very important, is that it means we should stop doing everything. We are in such a climate crisis. I mean, we're looking at end times right now. that we shouldn't be spending dollars, so everything we do has a carbon effect. And other than walking to the grocery store and walking home, nothing we do makes carbon sense. So if you want to put, $5,000 worth of insulation in your attic, it can be argued that you shouldn't be doing that now, because having a carbon impact on the planet, in the sense that anything you buy that's manufactured was produced with fossil fuel and electricity, all of that is disastrous right now. So we almost can't talk about the carbon analysis because it's so bleak. I mean, it means that the construction industry should cease. We should all make do with what we have. None of us is really living with a consistent climate perspective and making the climate, having a carbon footprint that we can be proud of. And I am absolutely in that position of not being proud of my carbon footprint. But what the carbon analysis says is maybe some things are okay in the 100-year term, but releasing anything in the next 10 years is bad. So really, were we consistent, we would just stop doing everything. So that's a bummer, isn't it?
Well, especially
That's such a downer.
Especially
I was like, did Martin just ruin everything?
Right, but there's such an enormous housing shortage, especially an affordable housing shortage. It's an incredible dichotomy, because we shouldn't build, but there are, people have no place to live. People can't have no place to live that they can afford.
Well, you're absolutely right. So, I mean, what does that mean? Do we build simple plywood boxes and forget the insulation? I mean, an argument can be made exactly that we should build absolute bare minimum, cheapo, house them now, but investing large amounts of extra money in building materials that have a 30-year payback don't make sense if you burn carbon to manufacture them. So that definitely changes everything. I don't have an answer to this. The embodied carbon thing is
what we're doing. What we're doing right now is most of our core and shell of our projects are carbon negative by using things like cellulose, wood, fiber board, potentially straw. There's a lot of methods that you can use to get a good amount of your project carbon negative. Now, all of that's going to go positive.
I mean,
all right.
Where do you get the carbon for your carbon negative? I mean, if it's recycled newspapers, I get it.
Yeah.
Recycled newspapers now are becoming rare enough that cellulose manufacturers are competing over the recycled newspapers. We have a shortage of recycled newspapers. The fact of the matter is, it's not carbon negative if you're cutting down trees to manufacture it.
Sure, scale is certainly a big topic of here. But the quote that I always hear that I cannot stop saying is, there's 5 times the amount of straw decomposing in fields than insulation that we install in buildings every year. So stuff exists that we can use that could work. That's very high level thinking.
But when I buy straw and my local straw suppliers, how far is it trucked? Right. Is it really the stuff that's getting burned in California? No, it's not the stuff that's getting burned in California. It's what's on the open market that somebody is putting on a tractor trailer and bringing to Vermont because people like me who can afford to buy it want a straw bale house because it's hip. It's very complicated. I'm not convinced that the straw bale house movement is reducing the burning of rice straw that is otherwise burned for a variety of reasons or plowed under.
Valid points. And that's why I know some industries that were using local materials have been shipping it over from Europe because the barge uses a lot less carbon than a big truck across the country. So,
well, I'm glad they're thinking about it. I don't really have an easy answer, but I think a lot of us,
it's a complicated question.
A lot of us who tout the idea of a carbon negative construction or embodied carbon means shoving lots of wood fiber into their buildings. I'm not convinced that fibers used in construction somehow helps the planet. It's very complicated. A lot of people just say it, oh, I've sequestered carbon. Well, maybe you should stop cutting down trees to sequester them. Maybe just leave them where they are, you know.
It's a valid point. Now, trees do store more carbon in the first 30 years of their life than later. So replanting them does help that process in terms of storing more carbon in those wood fibers. But anyway, it's definitely an interesting debate. I don't want to spend the whole time on it, but
right. And no, you're right. And I don't want to be a smart aleck. You're absolutely right.
Sure you do, Mark.
Sometimes that's fun.
What you also pointed out about tree growth is true for some forests, for some species in some climates. And it's very complicated because every forest is different. Some are managed, some are not managed. Some are growing in humid environments, some are growing in dry environments, and the planet has all kinds of forests. So, all
sustainably harvesting them. I mean, it's such a small portion of our industry that's going down the route of doing it a better way. It's scale that's the biggest issue here.
Right.
And I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
I'm a 65-year-old hippie who's simplified his Buddhist perspective on the universe. Right now, we're destroying the planet through fossil fuel burning, through capitalism, and through doing stuff. Really, a good way to think about doing less is don't use money. Spend less money, buy fewer things, just sit on your butt and stop doing stuff because the planet is burning. You know what I'm saying? It's not as complicated as we think. And building more buildings is not part of the solution. It's doing nothing that's part of the solution. But I'm not holding myself up as someone who's able to live a consistent life.
Well, I think you just summarized the beginning of the book. I remember that passage from the book and just being like, this is the first person who writes a construction book. Because I do view this as it is a book about residential construction in my mind, that says what we really ought to do is not build anything and not buy anything and not do anything. And then we could truly make the world a better place. And then because you're so pragmatic, you immediately went to, since I know you're not going to do that, here's how to do the least damage. Here's how to do the best with what you have. Here's how to waste the least money. And so, I mean, that's why this is so good. So I appreciate that you still hold that view. It lends legitimacy to me espousing it as my own view.
And I think Carl made a valid point. I'm sorry, I'll stop. But we do have people who need housing. So it's not like people who are dedicated to providing low-income housing are doing the wrong thing. They're absolutely doing the right thing. And it's a tough thing to solve. I'm sorry, Emily.
No, I was going to say, to go back to Brian's question, which was about renovations too, is, the other thing that I say all the time is things aren't no maintenance. And if you're not going to maintain things, right, then we have renovations that we have to do. And if you have to replace something that's gotten to the end of its usable life, that's an opportunity to make some improvements on a system. So,
right.
So Carl, you're next on my widget.
Oh, okay.
What would you like to roast? What would you like to roast Martin on?
Well, I have some notes here. I'll read through them. One is, as much as I hate to admit it, I actually think it's a really good book. I haven't read the whole thing in detail. I literally just, when I found I was on the show, I found a copy of it in my office that Abe had bought. So I went through it today. And I have a couple of points. I have things that I appreciate. You downplayed vapor retarders, which I thought was great because people tend to get very hung up on them. Really good analysis of attic air sealing, which I did last year on my daughter's house. And it is truly one of the most miserable jobs on the face of the earth, sealing up an attic. And you dealt with rain screens a lot, which is really good because most people, especially down here, just don't even think about it. A couple of things I think are missing. You had a really good description of an attic knee wall, but you really needed a good image of it. And I actually have one for you if you ever go to reprint. I can give it to you. Windows, I feel like you left out the idea of sash replacement kits in older houses. I think it's one of the best things to do in an old house. I've done it in several of them. And, it's something that people really need to understand about. And one thing I'm really concerned about is potential moisture issues when you're dense packing existing walls. I know there are issues, especially in cold climates, where dense packing a wall sort of basically kills the house. I just think that's something that people need to be aware of. If you don't have a good weather barrier, don't have good overhangs, and you're in a wet climate, dense packing walls can be really, really detrimental to a house. Couple of things. You had talked about the Zender ERV, and I almost see the Zender ERV as equivalent to your little drawing of the 2 inches of insulation on 7 houses versus 14 inches on 1 house. It's a killer product, but I just can't see, spending $8,000 on an ERV on any house. It just kind of does me in. And the last one is you had an interesting picture of the Passive House in Monterey, California. And I actually have seen Rob Nicely's projects, and I might have even seen that one. And he does a really good job. But the idea of somebody doing a Passive House in Monterey, California, where the mean temperature is 63 degrees year round and virtually nobody heats your air conditions is completely ridiculous. And I know Rob, and he markets Passive House really well, and he's got a good business, and he builds good houses, but it's complete bullshit that he's building passive houses there. It makes no sense.
Well, I agree with what you said, Carl, almost all of your points. And, a lot of the illustrations in this book, frankly, came from the Taunton Art Department, and I didn't choose them. And of course, you don't need a passive house in Monterey, California. Absolutely. And I don't think I ever advocated for doing that. But the only thing I would question you on is your alarmism about dense packing walls in cold climates. I mean, if you here in Vermont, weatherization contractors have been dense packing cellulose in old houses now for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And we've got lots and lots of experience doing it. It does not destroy walls. It often, probably, I think I can say often, increases the painting schedule. Mm-hmm. So what you have then is a wood clad exterior that used to be, painted on a 7 or 10 year schedule that now needs painting on a 5 or 6 year schedule. And I don't know the numbers. The numbers depend on the overhangs and the quality of the paint, the prep work. But it does that. I don't know about, and we live in a cold climate here in Vermont. So I would love to hear more about dense packing cellulose in old house walls destroys the walls. I'd like some more facts from you, Carl. And I will correct myself in public if you're right, because that's important. But it's just been done for so long up here that I think you're exaggerating. Okay. What's happening, though, in Vermont is, painting clapboard, whether it's every 7 years or every 5 years, is expensive. Yep. Nobody wants to paint clapboard anymore. And, people are charging $15,000 or $20,000 to paint a house. And the whole question of, can we afford to repaint our houses? It's beyond the question of the frequency of the cycle. And it's just something we're not going to be able to do much in the future because it's so darn expensive. That's either going to mean something like vinyl siding, which is ugly, or I like unpainted cedar clapboards, or unpainted cedar shingles, or something else other than the traditional painted clapboard that we've had in New England for so long. So that's a little bit of reaction to what you said about dense pack cellulose.
It's funny you talked about vinyl, because I was just up in Maine where I saw both Emily and Michael, and I was astounded at the amount of vinyl siding on the houses in Maine. I feel like every place I went, there was vinyl siding. I was like,
well, I sympathize with people who get a $20,000 painting bid and they say, I can put vinyl siding on for less than one paint job, and that's
I totally understand it.
Right.
That's the importance of rain screens, but
yeah,
anyway.
Exactly.
Right, vinyl has an instant rain screen. It includes the rain screen.
Unless you stuff it with EPS.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Brian Pontalillo, you're next on my screen. I would say you probably know this book inside and out because you probably read all the articles that he wrote beforehand. But do you have comments or thoughts on the book?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've actually never read the book exactly for that reason, because I was involved with, I was at Taunton when GBA was launched. I was reading these blogs as they were, Martin's posts as they were being published. So, I have the book and I've thumbed through it, and I've used it as a reference, but I've never actually sat down and read the book through. But what I wanted to ask Martin was about what isn't in the book, and are there topics that actually hit the cutting room floor that didn't make it that you wished were in there, or are there things since you published the book that as you've learned more about about building, about climate issues, are there things you would put in the book, would add to the book now, or things you would take out?
Well, I guess I haven't reread it for a while either. And in preparation for tonight's event, I didn't reread it. So I'm not sure how to answer that. I guess whenever I have an idea or a revision or a reflection that seems to me new or different, I will write about it. So the fact that I've continued to write a couple of blogs a month since I've been retired and wrote many blogs since this book was published means that my ideas do evolve, and most of the stuff is online in some form or another. My guess is I would stand by most of this advice in this book. I mean, it's basic, it's pretty taking the topics one by one as you build a house. But of course, so if people want to see what my obsessions are like these days or how I've changed my opinion, I guess check out GBA, because I do post things when I get an idea.
Yeah.
Well, so-
Oh, go ahead, Emily.
I was going to say, to capitalize on that, what have you written in the last 6 months, right? So that would be your obsession. Like, what's the one topic you feel like you've covered more than once in the last?
Well, I mean, partly because Kylie Jacques, the current editor, is urging me in that direction. I'm taking some of my older blogs and I'm rewriting them, or I'm revisiting topics. And we all know cathedral ceilings and attic ventilation and basements are topics that just keep coming back, and people keep asking questions. I can't write about them too much. So I've been re-looking at some of those topics and trying to bring a fresh perspective and make my advice more concise, because some of my earlier blogs were rambling and I tried to touch every single point, but sometimes people just want to know the 4 things or 5 things they're supposed to remember rather than the whole encyclopedia. I
have just a little pushback on the what Carl commented on about the idea of don't worry about vapor, stop air. I understand why that advice has been given and given so often, and why that is sort of like where building scientists and you, Martin, go a lot with people's questions. But at the same time, now I hear that repeated as if vapor doesn't matter. Like, I hear people having conversations about the control layers, and it's just like vapor doesn't matter. Just all you have to do about work is think about air sealing. And I think that's not true. I mean, vapor does matter. Air sealing's maybe more important. Maybe it's where we have to start, but then vapor matters. So I've been getting a little squishy about the way that I hear that kind of advice repeated in these circles a lot.
Well, the problem is that vapor matters, but vapor retarders tend to generally are done so poorly. And I'm not a cold climate guy, so I will defer to people in Maine. But vapor retarders, in the few places you need them, tend to be done so ineffectively that the air movement is what moves 98% of the moisture moves by air. So trying to put a vapor retarder in and not doing the air sealing is really ineffective.
Just want to add something that Allison Bales pointed out in the comments. Vapor does matter when it is a loose insulation in an attic, either closed or vapor open in an attic, and it's done as a hot roof. So in that scenario, vapor does matter in terms of the discussion. In general, yes, we get in the weeds in it way too much, as do I. But in those hot roof examples, it does make a difference. And I believe that point was pointed out in the book. So,
well,
yeah, I would agree with Brian that the vapor, of course, matters. I mean, it's one of the fundamental principles of building science that we have to understand air movement, heat movement, and vapor movement and water movement, or vapor/water movement in buildings. I mean, understanding those flows is what building science is all about. So you absolutely have got to take vapor into account and understand it. I think what Carl's referring to is also right. The trouble is when people use the term vapor barrier, they often mean polyethylene, and polyethylene has many functions. Sometimes it is acting as an air barrier, albeit usually a bad one. Sometimes it's acting as a vapor barrier, but people talk about vapor barriers without really knowing about vapor transport or knowing what flow they're trying to stop. And so it is necessary to dig in and explain how vapor flow works and how airflow works and the difference, and explain that the term vapor barrier is often misused. So I hope I've tried to do that, but I don't want to leave the impression that vapor doesn't matter. Of course it matters.
Yeah, I was inspecting a multifamily building in Pittsburgh once, and they had installed polyethylene on the inside of the walls prior to the drywall as the vapor barrier because that was code. And there was essentially no sealing of the vapor barrier they put up. They were just like tacking it up and leaving all kinds of holes and things. And I couldn't get them to remove it because they said it was required by the code. And I'm sure that it was only going to cause problems in that project. It was certainly not going to serve. It was not going to resist any vapor movement in that particular application.
Well, I would disagree with you, Carl. I mean, a vapor barrier doesn't have to be sealed or doesn't have to be 100% in order to retard the flow of vapor. And Joe Stiebrick talks about this a lot, which is why a polyethylene under a concrete slab with defects in it is a perfectly adequate vapor barrier. If it's 95% intact and 5% holes, it is a 95% effective vapor barrier. It's a lousy air barrier, though. So you're actually wrong in the Pittsburgh example.
Well, this, under a slab, certainly in a wall, it concerns me a lot in a wall because it's going to, there'll be a lot of, with the air conditioning running, there's going to be a lot of condensation in that wall.
Well, that's the point that you are on stronger footing about. If a house is air conditioned, you almost always can say with authority, you do not want polyethylene behind the drywall.
Right, and
that's the real issue.
I didn't say that. That was my point. When you're air conditioning a space, you don't want to have polyethylene in the walls.
That's a perfectly valid point. You're absolutely right.
Well, and I think here in the Northeast, we didn't used to do air conditioning. That was sort of the joke 5 years ago. It's like, oh, it's Maine. We don't have air conditioning, like just open the windows. But that's really changing and quickly. Right. And so, some buildings that didn't have problems but put polyethylene up might have some pretty severe issues, as this continues on. So I think that's a valid point. So, June, you're up.
I have a couple of general questions, and I don't think they're more like discussion questions, not yes or no or answer questions. And one relates back to what you were saying before, Martin, about how if we really want to do something about climate change and all of the disasters that spring from it, we should just stop doing everything, like everything. But we can't, right? But in the longer term, do you have any hope that would lie in a change to the source of energy away from fossil fuels? And when I say the source of energy, I mean, whether for driving or for heating homes or for what have you.
Well, as soon as you bring up the question of hope, it becomes a spiritual question. I always have hope. Hope is
right.
The belief
as do I.
Hope is the belief in that which you cannot see, that for which we have no evidence. Hope is an imagined future that we live for spiritually, and I absolutely have hope. Is there any rational reason to think that our planet is going to make a smooth transition to a renewable energy future? No, there's no rational reason, but I have hope. And again, it's a spiritual question.
Right. And I guess it was more like, not really about hope, but it was more, do you think the calculus would change significantly if we waved a magic wand and suddenly got all of the power for all of our various activities from non-fossil fuel sources?
Well, of course. I mean, right? The amazing thing about an all-electric society with an all renewable electricity grid is it's okay to waste energy. I mean, it doesn't matter how much you use. We don't have to be energy efficient anymore. I mean, when we reach the promised land, the golden arches and the rainbows and the unicorns and the birds are singing, who cares about saving energy? If we can afford it, let's just use it. So yeah, the only problem with energy right now is carbon emissions. Not the only problem. I mean, there's a lot of issues. I mean, social equity and environmental justice. I know there's a lot of issues, but no, you do not have to save energy if we ever have an all-electric future with renewable energy providing our electricity. It's just going to take a while to get there.
Right.
So then I want to know, is the best answer to just put more solar panels on the roof? Like back to Brian's original question about renovation is don't do anything, just put panels on your roof so you can waste your energy.
Well, I mean, it's a surprisingly good thing to do, to just get a ductless mini split and more solar panels. Believe it or not, it beats a lot of traditional weatherization stuff on a lot of analyses. That said, solar panels on roofs in Maine and Vermont does very little to solve our heating needs in the winter because of the disconnect between when the sun shines and when we use our energy. So this net zero energy movement has a fatal flaw, which is the fact that it's not really net zero. Even, I mean, if you as a homeowner have a zero electricity bill, that's all nice and good, but it just allows you to feel smug. We haven't really solved this.
And that brings something to mind. Is I remember about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about deep energy retrofits. And I haven't heard much about it lately. I don't know if that whole sort of trend went away. I don't know if anybody's got any insight on that. This is really just a question. That there's a lot of discussion about it many years ago, and that just seems to have drifted off.
Well, there were a lot of good studies, and Paul Eldrenkamp here in New England was one of the guys who did a lot of them, and we just all started looking at the numbers, and most deep energy retrofits cost $100,000, and some of them cost $180,000.
Yeah,
it was a 200-year payback,
yeah,
or whatever.
That's kind of what I figured.
It never made sense from an economic standpoint. And Paul Eldrenkamp, who talked people into doing it and found rich clients who were eager to do it, said as much. He gave several presentations at conferences who said, this is ridiculous. This is a waste of resources.
Right.
The payback is extreme. So deep energy retrofits just collapsed of their own weight because of the economic cost.
Thanks for the clarification. I just hadn't thought about it much in a while.
Travis, what did you call it once? I remember this distinctly. You called it deep pocket, right?
That sounds like something I would have said. I'm not that bright, but every once in a while.
No. I remember. I don't remember when, but I remember it was you who said it, and it was fantastic. And it's I'm in the middle of writing an article about energy retrofits, and I had because I wear various hats in my professional life. One of them is as a writer, the other is as an editor. And my brief was not to write how to, my brief was to approach it from a different angle, which is great. Love learning new things. Yet when I started to look into it, I really had the feeling of that old Hindu myth of turtles all the way down, i.e. there were so many different aspects to it, so many different types of obstacles that I felt if people were to do, when I say people, I mean in general, plus individuals, plus governments, government support, were to try to push them forward, it had to be a multi-pronged effort, because it's not just about finding the money. It's not, which many cases it is, but there are also other obstacles. And at any rate, it's a very thorny subject, shall we say.
Right. I mean, ultimately, it's not worth investing a lot of the world's resources for a small return in energy savings. We need to focus on the ways to reduce carbon emissions that are really the most bang for our buck, and deep energy retrofits are not that.
Right.
I mean, closing a coal plant is the thing we should be doing.
Right.
Carol, you're up. It's your turn to lead the discussion, if you will. And then there's a bunch of questions that I think have popped up from the chat. So
thanks, Emily. Yeah, I enjoyed the book, and as a passive house consultant, it was actually really timely, because one of the issues that I have with passive house is it's not affordable for most people. So I'd say that all of the passive houses that I've designed were houses that there was no budget, and people were paying cash for it. But my clientele right now is mostly people who have too small a budget to do what they want to do, and it's renovations. And I think fixing the buildings that we have is a much better use of resources than building new passive houses. So I think the book is helpful. I kind of wish that it had more about fixing old houses than focusing on the new construction. So I'd love to see a volume 2. And the other piece that I, that came to my mind, because it's part of the client's budget, which I try to respect. I try to encourage people to stick with that, because sometimes the builder will say, well, refinance it. But that's also a resource, right? Your time is a valuable resource. We talk about time being money, but money is time, and quality of life for me is working less. So I think that should be part of the balance in terms of fixing your old home.
Absolutely.
Very cool. And so speaking of fixing your older home, one of the questions that came up, and I think this is directly related to where you are now, Martin, is 1970s solar design. What was good and what was bad? It says you've been off grid since 1975. So,
I mean, my own personal journey and my own house that I'm living in are not models for anybody. I threw together a house when I was in my 20s with available materials and a small budget, and then gradually over the subsequent decades improved things step by step as I had more money. And it was a fine way to build, and a lot of my friends and people of our generation did that. But you don't end up with a particularly tight house or a model of construction when you do it that way.
Martin, what would you build now?
What would I build now? Yeah, that's what Brian asked me. I would, I believe in small rectangular houses. I tend to think like a New Englander, so I don't know what I would build in Georgia. You have to ask Carl that question.
I built a small rectangular house.
So you build a rectangular house. You don't have any bays or bump outs because that takes energy. You make it as airtight as possible, and you test it with a blower door. I would aim for 1 ACH 50, but if you can aim for a tighter house, why not? And even triple glazed windows now, I'm wondering whether it's worth it. I mean, I think that the code has ratcheted up since I started writing, and code minimum levels of insulation are pretty darn good. The problem these days is not so much that the code is inadequate. It's the fact is that most people don't really do code built houses the way they're supposed to. I mean, they cut corners, they find ways to use less than prescriptive levels, R values in cathedral ceilings, and this is code legal, and they often don't really blower door test, and the local inspector doesn't really insist on blower door testing. But I think the existing R values in the code aren't bad, and if in areas where it's easy to add more, like the attic, I would go a little higher.
Well, actually, in response to that, Martin,
simple and aim for an all-electric house. These days we're not going to be burning natural gas or diesel oil or fuel oil, heating oil much longer, and so start out with all electric, and then put some photovoltaic panels on the south roof if your local utility gives you a good deal.
With a battery backup when the power goes out?
No, batteries are not cost effective whatsoever. It's
so would you have a wood stove then, being in New England? Would you have a wood stove for when
well, if your house is tight enough, you could probably last a couple of days, in except the most extreme temperature without conditioning. But Martin, to your point, one of the things I bring up a lot is basic green building is essentially just competence. Like you talked about the fact that the code levels of insulation are good, but they're installed so poorly most of the time.
Right.
Yeah, and the air sealing is done so poorly. It's just, if we could just get people to meet all the codes, meet all the manufacturer's recommended instructions, and do good designs, like not put ducts in attics and things of that sort, we'd have incredibly high performance buildings without a whole lot of effort. It's just that the base level is illegal and incompetent. We have to sort of bring it up to legal competence.
That's where I see Energy Star these days.
So Carl, what would that look like in terms of of making changes in the system to help bring that about?
The problem is homes are commodities, and builders don't care about the home. Builders make their money on the land generally. The home is almost irrelevant, so they don't care about it. They just, new homes, they just build them and crank them out and sell them. And homeowners don't care about the quality construction. There's really no way for them to evaluate the quality of construction very well. Even if homes do get certified under Energy Star or something else, there's a lot of inconsistencies. A lot of people are certifying buildings that they're basically just writing the certificate and not even actually testing or inspecting the house. I don't know that there's a good way to do it in a capitalist society. In a free market, I don't know there's a good way to get buildings to perform well.
I think the other issue is that people aren't willing to invest in their homes because of how long they're going to live there. Martin is an example of somebody who's going to stay in his house probably for a long time, but the average American moves every 7 years. So I find it, when I talk to clients that aren't doing their forever home, they're not interested in investing in their home because they're never going to get that return on their investment.
Right. And when they go to sell the house, the high performance is not going to sell. The rain screen is not going to sell. The
durability, high performance, all of that doesn't matter. Health it's not part of it.
Countertops and the vaulted ceilings and the skylights and all the shit that doesn't make a difference is what's going to sell the house.
So it's the housing market issue in terms of how we value our housing. And it's not the case in other countries. And I'm sure in some other countries it's way worse than what we have here. But that's one of the bigger frustrations for me.
I can second that. It was impossible to even get a year's worth of utility bills. And the realtor just looked at me like, why would you even care? Like, why would that be a question? So I think there is that is definitely feeding into it. There's just no incentive.
Yeah. Both times I bought a new house, I wanted to look in the attic and the realtor's like, wow, I don't think I've ever had anybody ask me that before. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, what? So people just don't know.
Yeah, I did that too, Kyle. And my realtor is used to me, but their realtor looked at me like, she's really going to go up there in the, and I'll like come in with a ladder. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go up there. I'm going to look and see what's in here. But you're right. The appraisal
Did you bring a blower door?
I didn't bring a blower door, and you all know I bought an existing house and the blower door was 8.5 ACH. And so here's an example of a renovation is I fixed a hole in the ceiling. That should help. That was a good idea. It was like a 2x4 hole. Whoops.
So how do we change the culture then? Because it sounds like more than anything, the client, the potential owner is as much to blame as our tract home builders who are trying to fill the need that they're being faced with. I don't really know how you change a culture that wants a fast, cheap hamburger and not, a small farm to table meal. You know what I mean? I don't really feel that. I don't feel that we can change humanity on a large scale other than by trying to do these small examples of this is the right way to do it. We have builders and architects and mechanical system designers and experts on who care about good design and care about the outcome for not just the client's pocketbook, but for their comfort and for their health and all those things. I don't know what else to do. What can we do?
Well, I think that we could actually develop a system where we have real code inspection and we enforce the law. I'm sorry. I mean, other countries do it.
That's right.
I talked to some builders like Malcolm Taylor, posts on GBA from Green Building Advisor, from British Columbia on GBA. And he says, our code is enforced. Germany has codes and the codes are enforced. There are individual communities in the US where they care about energy efficiency and they have knowledgeable inspectors, and buildings cost more when contractors are licensed, contractors need classroom instruction, contractors need to pass exams, inspectors need to be educated, inspectors need to be paid well. All of this is going to raise costs, but that's how you do it. We have electrical inspection and plumbing inspection in this country, and in general, our electrical work and our plumbing work is up to the best standards in the world. And if you travel in Latin America or Asia, you'll see that electrical installations are different elsewhere because we have good electrical inspection. So why can't we do the same for structural? Well, we do for structural, for energy details. We could, we just choose not to.
Travis, back to your point, what's interesting is that there are big societal problems. We like lots of cheap stuff, which leads us to big box stores and now to Amazon and things like that. And we want big houses to put all that stuff in. We will drive long distances or order things in that just fill up our houses. If we could change to the point where people would need less, buy less, live in smaller, higher quality houses, we could accomplish that. But I just don't have any faith that our society is capable of that kind of transition.
That sort of sweeping change of people wanting less, I think, is a real challenge to accomplish. I think we're kind of wired to always pursue what's next and to get better and grow bigger. And I think that's sort of in the human condition as a survival function, going back to cave people. I could be wrong about that. I'm just a builder in Kansas City, but that's what I think might be true. And so I guess I wonder, we have great code enforcement here in Kansas City. We've got inspectors for all the things we just talked about. And, my partner Joe and I are in for 20 hours of continuing education every year. So we do all these things that we're talking about. And I feel like we build a pretty good house here, but still there are jurisdictions that we build in that are on the 2008 code or 2006 code, because we have an excellent builder group here that lobbies against the adoption of those modern codes, because you can't make as much money building a more energy efficient house. Yeah. And people want the price to be lower, which is what you were already citing as a condition. So I guess it is important to focus on renovation as a solution to that. It's important to focus on quality in all things. And most importantly, as you identified in your book, Martin, to want less, to do less, to not outsize things, to not seek to be in a betterment competition versus the Joneses. All that stuff is in here. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about it. And it does feel like these things make a difference to have these conversations, and to have this book on the shelf makes a difference to me too.
It's unfortunate too, because those things that are in here don't necessarily cost more. It just takes competency. It's paying attention to those details. Air sealing doesn't have to cost a lot more, if any at all. It just takes competency to connect. So that's my bigger issue with it. Yes, going passive house does cost more to go to those different higher levels of insulation and different levels of performance, but you're getting something out of that. But anyway.
No, you're right, Kyle, because we should stop using cost as an excuse to not do better things. And we need to educate our clients, and I think the general public, on the emotional aspects of the things that they're getting, right? Because a lot of people don't want to get into the weeds with you on building science and vapor drive and whatever. The people in our industry should know what that is and how that works. But like your clients don't want to know that. They don't necessarily want to know what's in the walls. They just want to know what's in the walls is healthy. It's not going to make them really sick, or it's going to, they can sit next to that window and be comfortable without putting the blinds down at night, because, it's February and it's 15 degrees outside, and you're going to pull the blinds because it's freezing to sit in your living room because you didn't spend enough time to orient the house the right direction, right? That doesn't cost more usually. I mean, unless you have a really challenging site, which is possible. But
well, the other thing that's frustrating is that I think someone that said that, houses, like buying a house on a cost per square foot is like buying a car by cost per pound. Everybody assumes every house should cost X amount per square foot. Go back to Martin's point about building a small square box. That's pretty inexpensive to build. You start putting cantilevers and vaults and bays and things like that, and people expect it to cost the same as a simple house. And it just, and it can, but only if you do a shitty job.
So this is a comment.
We haven't talked about aesthetics at all. As an architect, there are reasons for putting windows in besides just some daylight.
Light and air.
I mean, there's also connection with nature, the connection with your environment outdoors. And I think we've neglected to talk about aesthetics in this conversation.
I'm glad you brought that up, because back to the email that I sent to Martin when I asked him what he would build. And I wish I had it up on my screen right now, but the first thing he told me was to build something that I would love.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm sorry,
that I would love. Like before, he's talked about building a rectangle and a 12-pitch gable roof and double stud walls and cellulose insulation. The first thing he said is, you got to love your house. So I
is,
forget how he said it, but that's what he told me.
Carol, we're not talking about not putting windows. We're not talking about bad aesthetics. And I've seen plenty of very simple houses, including my own, that I think are very aesthetically pleasing. I've seen plenty of very complicated houses that are horror. They're just horrors. They're just really terrible. I don't think beauty has to be complex. To a certain extent, simplicity is often the most beautiful thing.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%. I'm living in the space that I'm in right now is 290 square feet. So I understand small, but my windows are really important, including my skylight, which I know that was on the banned list of.
Yeah, skylights.
Got to rip that out.
Skylights are fine in certain situations. It's just one of those things that people,
in a small space, if I hadn't put a small skylight in and I splayed the
they have their place for sure.
Yeah. So
right, and so there should be an overarching theme, and it's kind of what Brian said about where how do you start at the email is like, if it's your house, you want it to meet your needs and to please you, and saving energy is not the be all and the end all. And if your neighbor pays $80 a month for energy, and you want to pay $85 a month for energy, that's fine. It's not a contest. It's got to be something you love, and it's got to work for you. So I absolutely agree.
From all my energy modeling days, the biggest thing I learned from that was sort of your takeaways at the end of the passive solar section, which was sort of like, hey, orient it perfectly east-west. Hey, put all the windows on the south. Do all of these different things. When you do the modeling, you realize once you get good levels of insulation and decent windows, pretty airtight, put in a good mechanical system, you can kind of do whatever you want. And the utility bills don't change that drastically. It's still in the same ballpark. And so that's where you can really focus on aesthetics and do innovative and different things and not have to take a gigantic energy penalty from doing such. So it's given me more freedom in architecture by doing all that modeling and realizing, wow, if I make all these tweaks, we're talking dollars a year, not hundreds of dollars. So anyway.
So there's a comment this is a comment, not a question, but from Jamie in the chat box. I read this partly as a designer, partly as a homeowner, and on the verge of a complete overhaul of an 18th century farmhouse. Also as a New Hampshire transplant, this book helped highlight what I should and could care about and what to ask the GC and the subs. Also humbling to not care as much about the expensive stuff and balance the budget a bit. So that was a nice highlight there for you, Martin. But what is important from Paul, what is important to have a long-term plan so that each incremental renovation contributes to the improvement of the performance of, sorry, that was also not a question. What is important is to have a long-term plan so that each incremental renovation contributes to the improvement of the performance of a home. Looks like, I don't know if you talked about this at all in the book. I don't think so, but are there concerns that we get this, I think, a lot about EMF, the electromagnetic force and sensitivity for induction ranges or people who are going all electric? I mean, this is something that we keep hearing about. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on that?
Well, I did write an article on EMFs, and I start with the medical literature. My wife's a doctor, and so she has access to online up-to-date medical reports. And, the EMF field has been widely studied, and the type of electromagnetic fields that are encountered in residences do not cause any negative health effects. There was one study that showed a very slight possibility of childhood leukemia among people who live right under these high-powered, high-voltage power lines. And even that was disputed by other studies which found no such correlation. But the hysteria about smart meters on the wall and cell phones and electric wires in your bedroom and your the blanket on your bed, your electric blanket, is not supported by any medical studies.
So it's okay.
When these medical studies are developed and are accepted by the medical community, I'd be glad to change my advice to builders, but right now I don't see any evidence whatsoever that EMFs at the residential level are of concern to homeowners or builders.
So then on a much lighter topic, Allison wants to know why you shaved your mustache.
Well, because now that I'm retired, my wife and I occasionally go snorkeling, and I get a much better seal without a mustache on my.
True
so once
story.
again, it all comes into air sealing. I should have saw that.
It all comes into sealing, right? Water sealing.
Fantastic.
It's a water management issue.
Oh, that's funny. Feel free to chat amongst yourself as I'm trying to read and do these things as well. So I don't know if anything else came up.
Yeah,
Martin, where in the Northeast Kingdom are you doing all your snorkeling?
Well, we do travel. Although I have friends who snorkel in Vermont, and they, in Lake Morey and Lake Fairley, you can jump in and see fish in the summertime. It's just a lot colder. But I have had the opportunity to travel to warmer climates. And the question is, how often should we be taking airplane flights? In the light of our current crisis is one that I struggle with. So
that was my unspoken question for sure.
Martin, I had one other thing I was going to talk to you about. You talked a lot about ductless mini splits, and actually when I saw Emily, she uses them a lot, and I use them in my house, and I had been a really big fan of them, but I've become to sour on them a little bit, primarily because of the maintenance and repair issues. And I think in my house, in retrospect, I sort of wished I had done ducted mini splits instead, because what I found is the ductless mini splits, they're so complicated and there's so much stuff crammed into a little box that repair costs are ridiculous. I had a couple of coils fail under warranty, and they still cost me $2,000 a piece to get them replaced.
Oh my God.
And I have to have some fairly regular maintenance because they tend to get pretty dirty and they need to be cleaned regularly by the serviceman. So I've just, after I have 6 of them between 2 houses right now, and I think they're, in a new situation, retrofit, they make a lot of sense if you can't really tear up the house, but they do seem to have some real issues in terms of maintenance and repairs, which has become frustrating and costly for me.
Well, it's interesting to hear your experience, Carl, and we all benefit from hearing such stories. I think you may be on the just one of the unfortunate few, though. You've had more bad examples than other people. I mean, Mark Rosenbaum talks about how they put in dozens of them, and they're basically trouble-free from a callback perspective. But I'd like to talk to other people now that years have passed and see if your experience is common. I mean, you're right that they're somewhat sophisticated devices and there's a lot crammed into a small space. So interesting point of view, and I don't have enough experience to throw in my, viewpoint yet.
Yeah, I've had 2 coils fail out of three systems in the past 5 years. It's been costly.
Yeah, that's no good.
No.
Yeah.
So wrapping things up, because we're getting towards the end of the evening here, but some of the questions that actually from Mike that he put into the chat box is that he loved that you wrapped up the book with your pretty good manifesto. What was your role in helping to develop and promote the pretty good house concept then?
Absolutely none. And I maybe regret that it wasn't clearer in this book that the pretty good house concept was entirely developed by the wonderful people of Maine. So hats off to Mike. And like I say, Dan Colbert and others whose names I'm not mentioning, but should. I did not have my finger in that pie.
And do you have any advice for them as they're writing the book right now, based from this book? More visuals, less visuals, more content, less content, more,
more
technicals,
visuals.
less technical, more. Kyle wants more visuals.
My hats are off to the people writing the book. I'm sure they'll do a great job.
So since there are so many of you on with us tonight, and it's about 7:15-ish, I think now's our opportunity to go around the horn for your last thoughts on it, or your last question or comment to Martin or to another panelist as we kind of close out the evening, because unfortunately we're getting closer to that time. So, Brian, do you have any last thoughts? Brian Wiley, sorry, you're at the top of my screen.
I was just defaulting to Brian Pontalillo in terms of importance. I thought maybe. Well, I guess maybe not a question, but just thank you. The first time I heard the term embodied carbon was a podcast that you did with Fine Homebuilding, and it's completely changed the way I've thought about how I live and the space we inhabit, and some of the details you've provided on GBA and everybody else here as well, and all the knowledge you share. I mean, I have a conditioned crawl space that has made us so much healthier because I was able to pinpoint that and go through the details y'all provided and stuff. And so I guess, again, just thanks. And I hope you write a follow-up. I've got plenty of problems if you ever run out of material. And
Okay.
I do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Carl, that's you. Last thoughts, questions, comments.
Nothing. It's good to see you, Martin. We worked together at GBA for a while there, and you were fun to have as an editor. And I hope to see you back at summer camp someday.
Yeah, I hope to go. Summer camp didn't happen this year, did it? Did I miss it, or did it not happen?
2 years off. Yeah, hopefully next year.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So we need to beat COVID so we can get together again.
Yeah.
Brian Pontalillo.
I don't know. I guess third, Brian and Carl's gratitude for everything that Martin's brought to the table. I used so much of what I learned from Martin on the energy retrofit that I did a few years back. I know I'll be using a ton of it on this next project. And I refer to Martin's posts pretty much daily in my editing work at Fine Homebuilding and GBA, just to check facts and I just check in with Martin pretty regularly. So I appreciate that, Martin. You're retired but ever present on the staff.
There we go. Everybody's taken the thank yous right out of my mouth, but at the risk of sounding repetitive, I also want to thank you so much for this book. Because if it's one thing I love, it's a book that's really well organized and gives pragmatic, useful information. And that's exactly what it does. So yes, it's a keeper. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Carol?
Oh, yeah. I really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. And it was really timely for me with all of the low budget renovation projects I have right now. And I also wanted to thank you for mentioning Lunos, because I have Lunos in my space and I love them. And they were so easy to install. I also had to do a whole bunch of research to convince the electrical inspector in Burlington that they met the UL, because it didn't have a UL US sticker on it. So if anybody needs that information to convince their inspectors, drop me a note.
What are Lunos?
A Lunos is a pair of heat recovery ventilation. They're low voltage wired together and they switch back and forth every 70 seconds, preheating a ceramic core.
And
how loud is it?
And everybody asks it. Because I have a small space and it's just me, I usually have it on 10 CFM and I don't even hear them. And there's a summer mode. So in summer mode, it switches so that it runs for an hour at a time. So it's not preheating the air. So I have it running all the time instead of a fan.
Very cool. Kyle?
Thank you very much, Martin, for writing this book. It's definitely got a lot of my history of knowledge in it as well. And it's great that I can find so many of the things that I've learned over the years in one place and be able to reference others who come to me often of, hey, where do you learn what you learned? Like, well, here, start here. So this is a great reference book for them. I definitely thank you as well I feel like I was really diving deep into a rabbit hole as you described it. And it made me step back and think, how far is too far? And especially when clients are thinking, well, do I really need that? And I'm like, well, kind of. Do you really need that extra layer of insulation? Do you really need the passive house windows? Is our R7 good enough? Is R5 good enough? I thank you for pulling me out of that rabbit hole and bringing me back a little bit to where I started some of my knowledge, and to think broader about how to approach a pretty good house and different types of housing that I work on. So thank you.
All right, Travis, the floor is yours, and I'll cut you off if you go too long.
You're smart to say that, because that almost always happens. I'm not gifted with brevity, but luckily Kyle said a number of the things that I wanted to touch on. There's a lot of great things about this book. It is certainly an excellent reference. It's certainly a good starting point. It's certainly something that it's well organized and assembled in a way that you sort of introduce an idea and a viewpoint, and then there's also the little summary where I don't know. I'm not sharp enough to pick up on it the first time. So I appreciate reading it in Fine Homebuilding years ago, and then reading it again, and then reading it again, and then finally it's stuck in there. But what I appreciate most about it is that it does remind you to step back and not be enamored with the shiny new thing, and to fall into the rabbit hole, as Kyle described it. It really is, it's a holistic view to building and to environmental sustainability in my mind. But so much of it is very applicable to actual decision making and actual, like, actionable, hands on the material. I'm going to do a better job because I've read this book. So while everyone was very kind and said, thank you, Martin, for writing the book, of course, I'll have to say that as well. But I will point out that as a person who really does enjoy books and loves books, I only have 2 autographed books in my collection. One of them is the Macro Phenomenal Basketball Almanac, which I bet none of you have, but I would highly recommend it. It's excellent. It's by the Free Darko Collective. No one even knows what I'm talking about now, but you guys know this one. And this is my autographed copy of, so one of 2 autographs in my collection. I'm very grateful for it, Martin. Thank you for coming on the show. You're certainly a hero of mine, and I appreciate the time. And I didn't even run us past 7:30, Emily.
You didn't. I'm so proud of you. And I just wanted to say we should give a shout out to Taunton for making you do this. Martin, you wrote all the articles, but as much as I love GBA, you can get in that rabbit hole for a really long time. So I'm a book person as well. And I really appreciated how organized your book was. So I can say, oh, here's all those Martin articles that I can just read in one place. So, I mean, technically you created all the content to begin with, but big shout out to Taunton for making you put it into a book format. So those of us who don't have 15 hours a day to spend in the GBA rabbit hole can read a chapter a day and really get a lot of value out of it. So I do appreciate that. So now the floor is yours, since Travis didn't run over. Any last words, any articles that haunt you that you want to call up Brian in the middle of the night and say, take that down. We shouldn't do that. Or apparently, I don't know, I can't follow the chat box and the conversation, but it sounded like there was a whole bunch of things on there, like write another book, do all those things. So anything that haunts you, plans to write another book, any of that good stuff?
Well, first of all, I'm humbled and honored by everyone's comments. Thank you. And I'm glad people are reading the book. It's from Taunton's perspective, I don't think it's quite broken even yet. I mean, book publishing is a miserable industry, and almost no book publisher is really making any money. And this is one of those titles that hasn't ever made anybody any money. I never made any money on it, and I don't think Taunton did either. So the likelihood of a sequel is pretty unlikely as books fade away from our consciousness, even though some of us do like books. The other thing I'll say is there anything I've written that I regret? And of course, I've made mistakes. And the good thing about the internet is, as soon as someone posts a comment 2 days after I publish an article, I can correct it. I correct my articles all the time. I will sneak back to a 10-year-old article and delete an entire sentence. So it's, I try to do that. I mean, most of the articles that are up there have been corrected. And I welcome comments, and I correct my errors all the time.
That sounds kind of like 1984, Martin.
Yes, exactly. There is no history set in stone. It's all relative and fluid.
Well, apparently I cut you all off a little short. We're like 5 minutes shy of our end dates here. So if anybody has anything else they want to say, feel free to do it, and we'll close out at 7:30. But thank you so much for joining us. The book was great, and I appreciate it. So
Thanks all.
All right.
thank you for joining us.
Everybody for joining us tonight.
Thank you.